Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Lunch with Mia, understanding enhanced underinsured motorist coverage and what you need to know about the change in law effective July 1st, 2024. My name is Gia Wilkerson, and I'll be the moderator for the event today. Next, just a few housekeeping rules. This event is being recorded. Please leave phones and computers on mute for the duration of this event. If you have questions, please use the chat box and make sure that your questions are sent to everyone and not the speaker or host, and we will save the questions for the end. And now I would like to present to you Ms. Mary Jo Rogers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today's topic is understanding enhanced underinsured motorist coverages and the changes that took effect on July 1st. Next slide, please. This presentation does not provide legal advice. You should discuss specific questions with your trusted financial advisor or insurance producer. Next slide. What is the Maryland Insurance Administration? The Maryland Insurance Administration, MIA, is the state agency that regulates insurance in Maryland. The MIA licenses insurers and insurance producers, that is, agents or brokers, examines the business practices of licensees to ensure compliance, monitors solvency of insurers, reviews and approves insurance policy forms, reviews insurance rates to ensure rates are not inadequate, excessive, or unfairly discriminatory, investigate consumer and provider complaints and allegations of fraud. Next slide. If you feel that your insurer or insurance producer acted improperly, you have the right to file a complaint. Examples of improper actions include improperly denying or delaying payment of all or portions of a claim, improperly terminating your insurance policy, raising your insurance premiums without proper notice, making false statements to you in connection with the sale of insurance or processing of insurance claims, and overcharging you for services, including premium finance charges. Next slide. Minimum required coverages. Maryland car owners are required to get certain auto insurance coverages to be able to register their vehicles and obtain tags. Let's take a look at those requirements and some changes that have come in on July 1st for newly issued policies. Next slide. In order to get tags, the Maryland Motor Vehicle Administration will require the owner of a car to present proof of liability insurance. Liability insurance is the coverage that will pay another person if their property, such as their car, is damaged or if they are injured in an accident in which you are found to be at fault. Next slide. The minimum amount of liability coverage required by Maryland law is $15,000 of property damage coverage and $30,000 per person, $60,000 per accident if more than one person is injured of bodily injury coverage. You are also required to have at least $15,000 uninsured, underinsured property damage and $30,000, $60,000 uninsured, underinsured bodily injury coverage, though your coverage for uninsured, underinsured may not exceed the amount of liability coverage under your policy. Next slide. Uninsured motorist coverage will protect you if you are involved in an accident where the at-fault person does not have insurance or is unknown, such as a hit and run. Underinsured motorist coverage protects you if the at-fault person doesn't have enough coverage to fully pay your claim. Sometimes this happens when there is more than one person injured or more than one car damaged. Next slide. So let's take a look at a couple of questions. The amount of coverage for uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage is the same as the amount of your liability coverage. Is this true or false? Next slide. True. Generally, the amount of coverage for uninsured and underinsured motorists is the same as the amount of liability coverage you purchase. So if you get the minimum amount of liability coverage, and that's $15,000 property damage and $30,000, $60,000 in bodily injury, then your uninsured and underinsured amounts will be the same. Next slide. But if you buy $50,000 in property damage coverage and $250,000, $500,000 in bodily injury coverage, then the coverage limits for your uninsured and underinsured coverage would be $50,000 in property damage coverage and $250,000 and $500,000 in bodily injury coverage, unless you waive the excess coverage. If you waive the excess coverage in writing, you will still have the minimum amounts required by law, which is $15,000 property damage and $30,000, $60,000 bodily injury coverage in uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. Next slide. Now, let's look at how these coverages work. For example, you are hit by a driver and their insurer agrees that they are at fault. The insurer tells you that they will be settling your claim and that your car is a total loss. Your car is new and in great condition. Great news? Well, maybe not. Next slide. The insurer tells you that they determined your car is worth $25,000, but the at-fault driver's policy only has the minimum property damage liability coverage of $15,000. They make you an offer to settle your total loss for $15,000. Well, that is less than what your car is worth. Even worse, you still owe over $20,000 on your car loan. Don't they at least have to pay an amount equal to the balance on your loan? Let's see. Next slide. You think yes or no? Next slide. Well, the answer is no. They are only legally obligated to pay up to the amount of coverage limits on the at-fault driver's policy. So the next question is, what can you do? Next slide. Would underinsured motorist coverage pay the difference to fully settle the claim? Well, the answer depends upon the amounts and types of coverage under your policy. So let's take a look at the various options. Next slide. If you have standard uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage, and your policy only has the minimum amounts of liability coverage, again, $15,000 property damage, your underinsured motorist coverage would not apply, since the at-fault party's coverage amount and your underinsured coverage amount can't be added together under Maryland law. As a result, if you carry only the minimum amount of standard underinsured motorist coverage, generally the most you can collect from both insurance companies is $15,000. Next slide. Now, let's say your coverage limits are higher. For this example, your liability coverage amounts are $50,000 for property damage and $50,000, $100,000 for bodily injury coverage. You also have standard uninsured, underinsured coverage for the same amounts. In this scenario, the insurer for the at-fault party would pay $15,000 for your car, and your insurer would pay the remaining $10,000 to fully settle your claim. Next slide. Now, if you have enhanced underinsured motorist coverage, the final claim settlement may also be better than if you only had the minimum amounts of standard uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. So, what is enhanced underinsured motorist coverage? Next slide. Enhanced underinsured motorist coverage provides coverage, subject to the policy's limits, for bodily injury and property damage resulting from an accident caused by the underinsured at-fault driver. By law, the amount of enhanced underinsured motorist coverage must equal the amount of liability coverage for the property damage and bodily injury under the policy. Next slide. Additionally, under Maryland law, with this type of coverage, surviving relative of the insured is entitled to recover if the insured dies as a result of an accident arising out of ownership, maintenance, or use of the underinsured motor vehicle. Next slide. Now, let's say what happened in this scenario we talked about earlier if you had enhanced underinsured motorist coverage, often referred to as EUIM. Next slide. Even with the enhanced underinsured motorist coverage, if your policy has the minimum liability coverage of $15,000 property damage and $30,000, $60,000 in bodily injury, then you would have the same coverage limits for uninsured and underinsured coverage. But in the scenario described, you could recover more in settling your claim. So let's look at some of the different ways the claim would be settled. The at-fault driver's coverage is $15,000. In the first scenario, you had uninsured, underinsured coverage amounts of $15,000. You do not have enhanced underinsured motorist coverage. So the total amount, the maximum you could receive in settlement for the total loss of your $25,000 vehicle is $15,000. So let's look at the second scenario. Again, the at-fault driver has $15,000 in coverage for property damage. Your uninsured motorist, underinsured motorist coverage property damage amount is $50,000. In this case, you do not have the enhanced underinsured motorist coverage. The total amount available to settle your property damage would be $50,000. So in this case, that is more than enough to fully settle your claim of $25,000, the value of your car. Let's look at the third scenario. The at-fault driver again has that $15,000 in property damage coverage. You do not have standard uninsured, underinsured motorist coverages, but you have enhanced underinsured motorist coverage in the amount of $15,000. So those two amounts can be added together. The total amount available to settle your claim for property damage is $30,000. So again, you would be fully paid to settle your total loss in the amount of $25,000. Next slide. With enhanced underinsured motorist coverage, you can add the amounts of coverage under your policy and the at-fault driver's policy together. In the scenario here, the amount paid by the at-fault driver's insurer is $15,000. But since you can add the amounts of coverage together, there would be enough coverage under your policy to pay the $10,000 needed to fully settle your claim. Next slide. It is important to note that when adding the amounts of the at-fault driver's coverage to your enhanced underinsured motorist coverage of $15,000, you get a total of $30,000 in available coverage. This is important to note because if your damage had been greater than $25,000, you would not have had enough coverage without the enhanced underinsured motorist coverage. Next slide. For policies purchased before July 1st, 2024, enhanced underinsured motorist coverage was optional. If you had wanted this coverage, you would have had to ask your insurance producer, again, that's your agent or broker, for that coverage. Generally, adding enhanced underinsured motorist coverage will cause an increase in your auto insurance premiums. Next slide. Here's another question. Enhanced underinsured motorist coverage will be added to all automobile insurance policies effective July 1st, 2024. Is this true or false? Well, let's see. Next slide. False. Beginning on July 1st, 2024, this coverage will be automatically added to all new auto insurance policies written effective or after July 1st. If you do not want enhanced underinsured motorist coverage, you will have to opt out and sign a form provided by the insurer stating that you do not wish to add this coverage to your policy. However, enhanced underinsured motorist coverage will not be automatically added to existing policies, but you may ask your insurer to add it to an existing policy. Next slide. Next couple of slides are going to be the form that is needed to be filled out and signed for all new automobile insurance policies at this point, since this law took effect July 1st, which was 9 days ago. If at any time while the policy is in effect and you wish to change your coverages, you will again need to do so in writing. You cannot just call your producer or your insurer to make changes to your uninsured motorist coverage over the phone. This must be done in writing, which includes both paper forms and they can be electronically e-signed forms. Next slide. These are, and I know this is a little small and difficult to see. There is a consumer advisory on our website. We will provide the website at the end of this presentation that you can take a look at these forms and in a larger format and a little bit easier to read. But this will just give you a quick idea of what the forms look like. Next slide. Next slide. So let's review. If you have only the minimum amounts of standard uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage as required by law, the amount of your uninsured motorist coverage cannot be added to the amount of coverage carried by the at-fault party's coverage, even if there is not enough money to fully satisfy your claim. And this applies to both property damage settlements as well as any bodily injury claims. But if you have higher policy limits for your standard uninsured or underinsured coverage, you may have enough coverage to fully settle your claim. If you choose enhanced underinsured motorist coverage, you can add both policy amounts together, providing more money available to settle the claim. Again, if you and the other driver both carry minimum amounts of coverage, you cannot receive any additional payments from your insurer if you carry standard uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage. Next slide. One final point to share. Purchasing higher coverage amounts on your policy for both liability coverage and uninsured, underinsured coverages may provide better protection against financial loss in the event you're in an accident and are found to be at fault. If you do not carry enough coverage to fully settle the other person's claims, you may have to pay the difference in the amount of the claim and what your policy covers. Next slide. Generally, increasing your limits for liability and uninsured, underinsured coverages, or adding enhanced underinsured motorist coverage will both increase the cost of your auto insurance. You should speak with your insurer or trusted insurance producer about what is your best option and the cost of all of your options. Next slide. So again, here is our contact information. We are the Maryland Insurance Administration, toll free 1-800-492-6116 or 410-468-2000. Our website, and again, the forms are on our website in a more readable format. And our website is insurance.maryland.gov. We are also on a lot of the social network platforms, including Facebook and X. Next slide. We can now open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will be happy to answer the questions. Well, I'll give it another minute to see if anyone has any questions. If not, that will complete our presentation on enhanced underinsured motorist coverage.
Mary Jo, thank you so much for that wonderful information. Since we have no further questions, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's event. To help us evaluate the quality and the content of today's event, it would be very helpful if you could please click on the link in the chat and fill out the brief survey. You can also find out more about all of our upcoming events on our website at www.insurance.maryland.gov or subscribe to have our outreach calendar delivered directly to your inbox. Thank you.